All right, we are on to the third lecture of sports journalism, or the third mini lecture of sports journalism. Here we're going to focus on the sports story, looking at the most common types of sports stories and some of the basic elements that are in each type of sports story. And so let's get right into it. Three primary types that are sort of straightforward pieces. The first is a preview piece looking at a contest or a set of matchups that are coming. Sometimes this is a preview for a season. Really, it's a forecasting piece of looking at here's what we know and here's how potential matchups or potential games, potential sets of games might go down the road. The most common by far types of sports story is a gamer, also known as a recap, a game recap that happens almost immediately after the conclusion of a game. So a reporter would be assigned to cover for a Pacers game, for example, and they would turn in a gamer or a recap to whatever outlet immediately following the game, sort of highlighting what the final was, how the game was decided, sort of answering the who, what, when, where, and getting a little bit into the how and why as well. But a very much a straightforward piece, just covering what happened with this one event, or maybe a series recap if you're looking at something like baseball or a playoff series. The third is an analysis piece, and this is sort of also a post-game type of piece, and in some cases can be turned in right alongside a gamer or a recap, where you're breaking down further of sort of strategic decisions that the coaches made or players made throughout the game to help shape the outcome. You might also do an analysis at the end of non-conference play or the start of conference play, or an analysis at the end of conference play looking at postseason, whatever it might be. An analysis piece might come, but again, it's usually tied to actual results and then sort of breaking down why those results happened. And the fourth type of sports story that we're seeing a lot of is the enterprise story or the feature story. A lot of times these get showcased as kind of human interest pieces. We see a lot of this in the lead up to a major event, so leading into the Super Bowl or to the Olympics or to the Masters, whatever event it might be. We see a lot of human interest stories on sort of getting to know the players, their stories, maybe a charitable cause they're tied to. Again, usually focused in on individual players or individual coaches. Sometimes it's sort of a team-wide type of story or a community type of story. But these are really sort of deeper feature pieces or individual. And what all of these pieces have in common are really the answers that they get to is the basic who, what, when, where, and then to some extent the why and the how. So most of the time it's centered around sort of a singular point, which is often called the focus or the angle in newsrooms. And really that the basics of it in most stories, it's sort of the inverted pyramid. Most of it is the who, what, when, where is in that first paragraph, or even sometimes the first sentence. And then the rest of the story, quotes, details, other information, is really the how and the why of the story. So if we have those, think about those main types of stories that are the most common types of stories. Each of those, regardless of how they come out, it still contains these basic questions and basic answers of the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And again, very much centered around a singular point, often called the angle. And so all of these answers play out in a common sort of format for all these stories, and the basic elements of the story are sort of as follows. The headline for all of these, so these are universal elements across sports stories. So there's a headline, something that's both a little bit descriptive, a little bit enticing, and then there's the lead sentence. Most straight news stories have that lead sentence be sort of a summary lead of the who, what, when, where, of sort of what happened. Beyond that, we have kind of the nut graph, which is sort of the so what, why it matters to you, taking whatever the event might be or whatever the sort of issue might be and giving it application or sort of usability or some way making it meaningful for the reader. And then beyond that, we have the sort of the body of the story, which is further details, expanding on that lead sentence or lead paragraph or nut paragraph, quotes, sound bites, and so on that all sort of support that sort of singular angle, that singular idea that runs through the story. And then we have the ending to the story. So let's talk about each of these a little bit in the coming slides. And so the first that we come to is the headline. identifying the main idea of the story, also giving a little bit of sort of enticing, a little bit of engagement, trying to draw the reader into the story, but to some extent, beyond sort of the enticing, and we don't want to move too far into sort of clickbait headline style writing. Beyond sort of the enticing, the sort of maybe the attractiveness of the lead, or of the headline, I should say, what we're really wanting is a decision point for the reader, or really wanting to give them enough information about the story in the headline that they can make the call of whether to read on, or whether this story isn't necessarily what they need or what they want at this time, and they move on to something else. So it's really about sort of our first impression, but it's also our first sort of bit of information that we're giving to the reader or the consumer, whatever platform we might be operating in. So we should be able to identify the main point of a story from the headline, or the headline from the main point of the story. So whichever one you come up with first, should be able to sort of help you sort out the other. And then once we get the reader past the headline, or the consumer past the headline, we move into the lead, which is our first paragraph. Sometimes it's a couple paragraphs long. It's the most important element of our story. It's where sort of we give our most important information. It often contains what's called the hook, which is really our sort of so what, or why it matters to you as a reader or a viewer or a consumer, why you need to continue reading on, or why you need to buy into this story because it matters to you. So again, it's sort of an expansion of those ideas in the headline of we give enough information so that the person looking at it can decide if it's for them, if they want to read on, or if they need to read on, or if it's not for them, and they can move on to something else. This is really expanded out in the lead, where we start to give sort of the heart of the story, and they can make that call of whether yes, I'm moving through this story, or no, I'm just going to move on from the story. The lead is often written in a single sentence even. So the opening paragraph of an inverted pyramid, sort of a straight news story covering maybe, let's say, an event. Often the lead is a single sentence that it runs the sort of the length of a paragraph, and gives all of that sort of critical, most important information: the who, what, when, where, and then perhaps a little bit into the why and how as the story, as it moves a little bit deeper into the story. And so I mentioned that the lead often contains that who, what, when, where, in which case it would be called a summary lead. So there's a couple other ways of leading into a story, where there's a mystery lead, or a delayed lead, or an anecdotal lead. There's a bunch of other, often called soft leads or delayed leads, where you are trying to bring the reader in, or bring the consumer in, or the viewer in, more buying into the story of it, more buying into sort of the enticement of it, rather than just sort of the kind of the X's and O's of it, or the who, what, when, where, kind of the those main questions that we're answering. So you bring it in with a story or some other sort of narrative, or some other way to entice them, would be a delayed lead. But a summary lead is when you sort of hit them over the head with the who, what, when, where. Most of of the sports journalism world operates with that as their lead, of sort of who played, where it was, what the outcome was, when it was. All those sort of elements are all built into their summary lead. And oftentimes it's a relatively short lead, and we're putting our most critical information at the... And once we get through the lead, we often come to the focus graph, or the nut graph. And here is really connecting what happened with where sort of the consumer is, and how those two things are connected, and what it means for the reader or the viewer, why it's important to them, what the sort of the crux of the story is, and why it's critical for them to understand it, and them to be able to think about it in terms of their own existence, their own life, their own routines, whatever it might be. In some cases, when we work with a summary lead, there is less need for a nut graph. The summary lead, depending on the story content, the summary lead may in effect be the nut graph, where it's outlining sort of what happened and why it's important, all in that opening summary lead, rather than sort of kicking it down the road to a nut graph. If we let in with sort of a delayed lead, of where we're trying to get people to buy into some sort of anecdote or story about a person, rather than sort of the larger story, if we had that type of delayed lead, then we would need a nut graph of saying, okay, we have this sort of opening anecdote that brings you into the story, and now here's what the real big story is about, and here's how it applies to your life. And once the sports journalist gets through the lead and the nut graph, we're really into the body of the story. So this is really a matter of finding elements that support that sort of singular angle that we're focused on. So if it's a story about a basketball game, who won, who lost, the supporting paragraphs are all about sort of breaking down this team's offense, this team's defensive work, foul troubles, injuries, whatever, coaching strategy, whatever it might be. All of the subsequent paragraphs are all still supporting that sort of main idea of the story. Helps make the story more interesting, gives a sort of larger context. We talk to players, we talk to coaches, experts perhaps, to analyze and break down the game. But all of this is still in support of that sort of singular angle or singular sort of. And once we're through the body of the story, we move into the ending, often called the kicker of a story. In a lot of stories, we end with future action. So we end with, all right, this is where we're at right now. Coming up on Tuesday is X, Y, and Z, or if it's a sports story, we often see sort of at the end of a gamer, when you were wrapping up or recapping a game, we see, oh, and the Bulldogs will be back in action again on Tuesday against Xavier, or whatever the case might be. So that'd be a future action where it's looking at, all right, here's where we are right now, and here's where the next step or next couple steps are going to be for this particular story. Other times, if we're not looking for a future action kicker, we have some sort of summary quote or statement, not necessarily repeating what's been said earlier, but just kind of summarizing where we are now at the end of all this story. Perhaps a nice quote from somebody, one of the key players in the story, to sort of summarize how sort of the mood of the story and kind of wrapping it all up. Another type of kicker would be sort of a more elaboration, or for more information, go to here, go to this website, go to this whatever, call this phone number, check out this blog, check out this social media account, whatever it might be, for more information on the story. And I've mentioned a few times now the idea of the inverted pyramid. So what we're talking about here is really how it's a sort of a flip of our normal storytelling in our everyday life. So normally in storytelling, we don't give away the ending at the start of a story. But that's not the case in sports journalism or journalism as a sort of a larger industry. The inverted pyramid says we do give the most important information at the front end, and the further you go in a story, the less critical or less important the information is. So we give the absolute most important thing at the front end, and that's usually the what happened kind of answer. So the who, what, when, where, and then somewhere in the middle we have how and why to give a little bit more context or understanding. But again, we start. Think of just an upside-down triangle. The most critical information at the top, and then as we move through the story, we get less and less and less important or less critical information. So if you read only the first few paragraphs, you would probably get sort of a pretty good understanding of the story without necessarily having to read the last 2 paragraphs or the last 3 paragraphs. Most important stuff at the front end. This was developed for a couple reasons. One, it's helpful for the readers to hit them with the most important information right off the top. But second, if we think back into the world of print journalism and sort of page space and how much a story could fit in, this helps with the editing process. You start with your most critical information, and if let's say you write 10 paragraphs of a story, but the editor says, well, we can only have 8 paragraphs, it's much easier in this style to lop off those last 2 paragraphs because they are, by structure, the least important paragraphs of the 10-paragraph story. It's a little bit of a challenge, of course, because we give away the ending and what's really the incentive to read on. If they already know what happened, they might not care about all the details, so they get their first paragraph and then they move away from the story. It's sort of a real possibility and sort of a real risk, but it's the style, sort of the standard style of the journalism world and the sports journalism world. So as I just mentioned, it helps the reader decide what's most important, what's least important. It helps the writer decide what's most important, what's least important. Gets critical information, crucial information to the reader as quickly as possible. So if we are covering something that has sort of a deep and powerful impact on the reader, it would seem almost unethical to put that information at the back end of the story and have them sort of wade through a lengthy story just to get to that critical information. So in some ways, it's sort of a responsible telling of information that's critical to an audience. But like I said, there are disadvantages to the inverted pyramid style. We give away the outcome at the beginning, and the reader therefore may not read beyond the sort of the opening paragraph or so once they get the crux of the story. And that wraps up the third of three sports journalism lectures, mini lectures. The big takeaways from all three of these are understanding linear versus nonlinear production on the journalism, sports journalism side, and linear versus nonlinear consumption on the sports consumer side. Understanding which assets lure readers, which keep readers, common types of sports stories, the basic elements of every sports story, and then understanding the inverted pyramid as I just laid it out, advantages and disadvantages of it. All right, that's all for this lecture.